leurs habitations et mis à l'abri, a fait savoir Moscou.
Viktor Orban persiste et signe. La Hongrie ne tolérera pas l'adhésion de l'Ukraine à l'Union européenne. Le Premier ministre populiste s'est notamment exprimé à ce sujet lors de la fête nationale du 15 mars au Musée national. L'homme fort de Budapest a déclaré que les juges, les journalistes ou les employés civils payés par l'étranger seraient chassés du pays comme la vermine.
És mindig akad egy birodalom, ami a magyarok szabadságára pályázik. Most épp egy brüsszeli. Brüsszel visszaél a hatalmával, ahogy Bécs tette annak idején.
La Hongrie fait depuis longtemps figure de récalcitrant quant aux initiatives européennes de soutien à l'Ukraine dans sa résistance à l'invasion russe à grande échelle. Viktor Orban utilise régulièrement la menace de veto pour obtenir des concessions de Bruxelles. Ses partisans, acquis à sa cause, n'hésitent pas à répéter les théories de conspiration d'inspiration russe.
Mindenkivel szóba áll, meg ő vele is szóba állnak mindenki. És nagyon sajnálom, hogy a franciák nem tanultak Napóleontól, mert most is le akarják győzni Oroszországot.
Se présentant comme le parti de la paix, le gouvernement hongrois a demandé à l'UE de s'abstenir de toute nouvelle initiative susceptible de compromettre les négociations lancées par Donald Trump. La NASA et SpaceX ont lancé un équipage très attendu vers la Station spatiale internationale pour remplacer les astronautes bloqués là-bas depuis des mois. Les astronautes américains Butch Wilmore et Suni Williams sont coincés dans le laboratoire orbital de l'ISS depuis 9 mois. La fusée Falcon 9 de SpaceX a décollé du centre spatial Kennedy de la NASA en Floride avec à son bord 4 astronautes pour les remplacer. Wilmore et Williams ont été les premiers à se rendre à l'ISS Starliner de Boeing en juin pour un voyage qui devait durer 8 jours. Mais les problèmes liés au système de propulsion de Starliner pendant le vol ont retardé le retour, la NASA ayant jugé l'engin trop risqué pour l'emprunter. La nouvelle mission de rendement s'amarrera à la Station spatiale internationale. Dans la nuit de samedi à dimanche, Wilmer et Williams devraient quitter la station mercredi.
And there you can...
This week on the Europe Conversation on Euronews, I catch up with French EU Affairs Minister Benjamin Haddad, and I ask him whether Europe can supply security guarantees for Ukraine without a US backstop. He also discusses why France is ready to extend its nuclear guarantees to the rest of Europe. Minister, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I just want to start off with where we are right now, what your assessment is. President Macron saying that he's willing to extend nuclear deterrent guarantees for the course of Europe. We also have leaders in Poland and Latvia saying they're going to train men of military age, talking about conscription. I mean, we're really entering a new era.
We have the questions arising from the United States about the future of the transatlantic relationship. And this is a moment for us to take our destiny into our own hands. We've been seeing in the last few years, the last few decades, Europeans sliding behind when it comes to defense, when it comes to tech, investment in AI or quantum, when it comes to industry. And this is a moment where we can come together, unite, invest massively into our strategic autonomy through defense.
What is your assessment of what Donald Trump, the actions of the White House in relation to Ukraine, stopping the military intelligence which has been exploited, and also stopping weapons?
I think they go against even the interest of the United States. How can it be in the interest of the United States to give a victory to Putin, to show capitulation in Ukraine? What kind of message would that send to China and to other competitors? And if you allow me to take a step back on this, you know, the truth is we've seen a longer term trend in the last 10, 15 years from the United States. It's President Obama who talked about Europeans being free riders, who did not respect the red line in Syria. It's the first term of President Trump. We already talked about trade conflicts or defense spending. And even on the Biden administration, which in the tone was much more sympathetic, of course, you know, we had the unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan. that was done without coordination with allies like Germany and Britain who were on the ground. We had AUKUS, the submarine crisis with France, and we had the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, a massive protectionist program which amplified everything the Trump administration was doing on protectionism without any coordination with Europeans. So you see these trends of the US focusing on itself, focusing on Asia, protectionist trends, leaving the WTO, for example, at the expense of Europeans. So we need to see the writing on the wall.
But it looks like that the United States hasn't called for Putin or Russia to make any concessions while President Zelensky is expected to sign this minerals deal.
You're completely right. We need to continue to increase the pressure on Russia. No negotiation about the security of Ukraine can be done without Ukrainians, and no negotiation about the security of Europe can be done without Europeans. And Europeans will play a key role in any form of security guarantee in the long run, and this is why we need to be around the table.
But we don't have any guarantee, and it's not likely to be forthcoming in relation to a backstop from the United States. I mean, President Macron had a very cordial meeting with President Trump a short time ago, but nothing substantial emerged from it. Can Europe defend Ukraine so there isn't a Minsk I, Minsk II situation without a backstop from the United States?
This is why we continue our dialogue with the United States on the need for the US to stay committed to the security of Ukraine, because once again, it is not sending a message of force to other competitors in the US if you lead to a situation where Russia can just rearm and re-attack Ukraine. It would be not in the interest, of course, of Europeans and Ukrainians, but not in the interest of the US either.
But can Europe do it? I mean, we're talking about a short time ahead, potentially, because Donald Trump is putting huge pressure on President Zelensky to come to the table. He says that Putin wants to end it. He wants this to be over. He wants to pivot to China and so on. So can Europe do it without a backstop from the United States?
Look, at the very least, I can tell you that this is why President Macron has asked the government, and other European governments are looking at stepping up our support for Ukraine and replacing the support from the United States, because once again, it is the security of Europe that is being played in Ukraine, and stepping up also on security guarantees while keeping our dialogue with the United States.
So potentially looking at Europe doing it without the United States, if it has to be.
Without speculating on scenarios in the long run, because we're keeping our dialogue with the United States, because once again, it's our security interest on both sides that's at play. But this is also why you see Europeans stepping up both on the support of Ukraine and in defense of Europe.
And in relation to troops on the ground, would they be potentially deterrent troops, not just peacekeeping troops?
Well, look, the question is, once again, if you have tomorrow a ceasefire, you need to be able to have a force to be able to preserve it, a peacekeeping force, if you will. So this is where Europeans will have to take their responsibility. We are ready to do so. We've already said so with other able and willing partners. You've heard the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom already talk about deployment of a contingent. Of course, not to fight war. We always need to underscore this, but to be able to keep the peace on the ground in the long run, and this is a discussion that's being held right now among allies.
Okay, I want to ask you about that extraordinary offer or announcement by President Macron about France extending its nuclear deterrence throughout Europe. What does this mean exactly? Is that the European Union? Is it the whole of Europe? Is it Ukraine? Is it within NATO?
Of course, the French nuclear deterrent will always stay sovereign in the sovereign decision of the head of state of the French Republic. So it's no question, of course, of sharing the use of the nuclear deterrent, the nuclear button, if you will. With that being said, French presidents, ever since General de Gaulle, actually the founder of the French nuclear deterrent, have always said that French nuclear deterrent is here to protect the vital interest of the French nation, and these vital interests have a European dimension. Of course, when our neighbors and our allies in Europe are attacked, it has an impact on the French vital interest. So what President Macron has said is that he wants to open a conversation with partners who want it. And he said this actually for the last few years, this is not something new, about how the French nuclear deterrent can contribute to the security of European partners. It's been striking to see that the next Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, was actually quite forthcoming in a recent statement saying that he wants to have this conversation. This is something very important to us.
So it could potentially, though, include Ukraine, for example.
I think let's see, where that could go. But at the very least, having this conversation with Germany and other countries in Europe.
And I want to talk to you about defence as well and investment, because obviously that is something that each country is really having to put money in towards and taking out of their exchequer. In France in particular, you have a very good social system, a very strong social system that's coveted across the world. Where would that money be coming from for all this major investment from France?
There's a few responses to your question. First, about what we could do at the European level. So the European Commission just on Thursday announced a series of measures to relax budgetary rules to make it easier for national member states to be able to invest in defense. That's already a major step, and that's something that we have been advocating alongside partners in Europe for a long time. Then a loan from the European Commission, 150 billion euros to member states when they invest in the capabilities that I was mentioning earlier, where we are lagging. You have the possibility of creating Eurobonds, borrowing money. Look, we did it during the COVID crisis, right? We've benefited from decades from what we call the peace dividends, which basically that we could invest in our domestic politics when the United States was taking care of our security. To be fair, in France, a little less so than elsewhere, because we have our nuclear deterrent and because we have constantly invested in defense. But yes, we will have to make budgetary decisions. And this is the conversation we're having in France right now about how we can increase our defense budget while keeping investors, so not raising taxes, keeping our companies here, keeping investors. Does that mean working more? If you look at the amount of time worked in France compared to other European countries, we're slightly behind.
Is France ready for that discussion? Because we know that domestically, from a political perspective, everybody's quite divided. You have the rise of far-right parties and so on. Serious problems getting the budget passed recently.
It will have to be a moment of responsibility for everyone. We see the world around us, and I think the French are very lucid, very conscious about the world that is changing.
Just before I let you go, Minister, just two more questions. First of all, do you think that this decision by President Macron to extend nuclear guarantees to Europe will bring France under the threat of Russia? Because we know the Russians have said that this announcement threatens them. And second of all, one of the things that you've spoken about is the decades of Europeans buying US weapons. And you said you have concerns before that these could become immobilized.
First, I would say, if you allow me to answer quickly your second question, Russia is already a threat to France and to Europe. We see cyber attacks, we see foreign interference, we see Russia going after our interest and influence elsewhere. We see the incredible pressure we've seen on democracies like Romania or Moldova. We see, of course, the aggression against Ukraine. Through Ukraine, we know that Russia is going after the European security architecture, and that it's targeted France also repeatedly. To your question on the industry, it's a very important point because we support the notion of the European preference for funding for our European defense industry, because the only way to have an autonomous European defense industry is to make sure that you have the control of the technology, so you have the technological know-how. Look at just the debates we had over the long-range missiles sent to Ukraine. If you have American components and Americans decide that they can't do deep strike to be able to defend themselves against Russian targets, they can control the use, even though the European countries that will want Ukrainians to be able to do so have agreed to it. So there is the question of control of use, there's the question of technology. And I would even say, if you want to make the case also that we need to increase our defense budget in the long run, politically you also need to show that it trickles down in terms of reindustrialization, in terms of factories, in terms of job, not that it's funding defense factories in Kentucky or Pennsylvania. I think it's a fair point.
Okay, Benjamin Haddad, Minister for European Affairs of France, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Balance disorders are one of the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, a greatly misunderstood disease with all too visible effects. Fondation France Sclérose en Plaques, together to cure.
Every year, millions of tons of food and textile waste are generated in the European Union. But the mantra of reduce, reuse and recycle to promote the circular economy, like we see in this center, does not seem enough to drive real change. There was a recent agreement to revise the Waste Framework Directive, but critics say that is not ambitious enough. The fight against waste is at the heart of this week's EU Decoding.
Around 60 million tons of food waste are generated in the EU every year, causing economic losses of 132 billion euro. Annually, the bloc also generates almost 13 million tons of textile waste, of which 5.2 million tons are clothing and footwear, equivalent to 12 kilograms per person. The European Council and the European Parliament have just reached a provisional agreement on the Waste Framework Directive, setting new reduction targets to be met by 2030.
The new legally binding targets will oblige governments to better promote the circular economy to retail and industry. Let's hear what people have to say about more sustainable production and consumption.
Food that is often discarded could be made cheaper, so people would buy it, eat it, instead of just throwing it away. As a society, I think it's a shame that we waste so much.
For textile, I think that we have to change our lifestyle about it, and we have to buy less textile but better quality.
Oui, mais il y a beaucoup de nourriture qui sont données à des associations. Je ne pense pas qu'il y a vraiment de la nourriture qui est jetée.
Da sind wir halt eine Gesellschaft geworden, eine schnelle Wegwerfgesellschaft. Das wird alles nicht repariert, wenn was kaputt ist, sondern es wird halt gleich ersetzt und neu gekauft und nicht nochmal verwertet.
Ich glaube, man muss wirklich mehr Aufklärung, wie gesagt, auf der einen Seite und politische Einflussnahme auf der anderen Seite zusammenbringen.
With us is Robert Hodgson to explain the target revision of the Waste Framework Directive. In the food sector, what targets do member states need to hit by 2030?
So there are two targets they have to hit by the end of 2030. There's a 30% target for reduction of food waste in retail, supermarkets and so on, in restaurants and catering, and households. There's a separate target of 10%, which applies to the manufacture of foods and the processing of foods, so before it reaches supermarket shelves.
On the other side, about 11% of food waste occurs in the farmers sector, but there is no specific target for farmers. And this was criticized by the European Consumer Organization. Why were they exempted from this?
One of the problems is that farming's become a very hot political potato in recent months. The European Parliament originally wanted to have a review by the end of this year with a possible target for what they call primary production, which is farming, to be put in place. In the end, when the negotiations were finished, we're left with a review clause, which means by the end of 27, they'll review the way the whole system is working and then decide if there is any scope to extend it to the farming sector.
And in the textile sector, there are no specific targets to be met. Instead, they will be covered for the so-called extended producer responsibility regime. What is this about?
And it basically means that if you want to sell clothes, you have to pay a certain fee as well, which is theoretically then channeled into the collection and sorting and recycling of clothes once they get to the waste stage after use. So individual countries will have leeway to increase those fees in the case of fast fashion based on ideas about how clothes are marketed and how long they're intended to be worn. And if they meet certain requirements, then they can increase the fees for, companies that produce what are sometimes regarded as disposable clothes or throwaway clothes.
Some member states are performing better at reducing waste. Some of the best mechanisms for donating food that is still safe to eat can be found in Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Portugal. There's also a proposal for textiles to be classed alongside plastics and electronics in the international treaty, aimed at preventing transfer of hazardous waste to less developed countries. This is supported by Austria, Denmark, Finland, France, and Sweden.
With us is Green Danish lawmaker Rasmus Nordqvist, shadow rapporteur on this directive. How confident are you that these new targets for food waste are going to make a real change when they seem less ambitions than what the UN and activists are demanding?
I mean, you can always go in and say, yes, we could have done more, but I think with these targets, we're going to see concrete action in the member states. And food waste is a huge problem when you look globally at the need for food. Everybody can see it makes no sense to throw out good food. We need to keep it, we need to eat it, and we need to make this transition.
But a lot of food that is still good for consumption, like you say, ends up in the trash bin, especially in the so-called high-end environments like casinos, hotels, cruises. Should these be more monitored?
It should be monitored in a way that this demands a change of how people are working with food. How do we use all the ingredients? How do we also not make up too much for these oversized buffets that nobody is eating? So when I talk to chefs and when I talk to restaurants, they're actually very keen to do this because also nobody likes to throw out good food.
Now let's talk about textiles. Will these new rules make a real change, considering that a lot of the fast and cheap fashion is coming from outside the EU via the online platforms, namely from China?
There is a big problem with the ultra-fast fashion coming from China. But let's remember as well, fast fashion is not a new thing. We have big European corporations working within the fast fashion industry, and they have to change as well. So with the new producer responsibility, we are actually demanding of them to take responsibility all the way through the value chain.
And finally, the EU is somehow also part of this illegal textile waste export circuit to less developed countries. Do you think that the directive will curb this somehow?
It's important for me to say we're not going to change the whole industry just with this directive, but it's an important step because we need to, first of all, look at how are we consuming textiles, but also what do we do with them after. And we need circularity. That's the next step, is also to make demands on how much circular economy is within fashion industry, but that's for the next step.
Foods and textiles are two European industries that need to adapt the most to the Green Deal. But it's not just about the production methods to reduce natural resources and polluting gas emissions. Developing new approaches to the waste culture, like we see here in this neighborhood compost, is a big part of the challenge.
The EU. Some people love it, some loathe it, and others dream of joining it. One thing is sure, everyone's talking about it, so let's talk about it too. From the economy to climate to the EU's role in global affairs, 30 minutes of debate and humour to find out what these institutions really mean for our daily lives. So, Russell, my love, join the conversation all weekend on Euronews.
About the security of Europe can be done without Europeans, and Europe can be done without Europeans, and Europeans will play a key role in any form of security guarantee in the long run, and this is why we need to be around the table.
But we don't have any guarantee, and it's not likely to be forthcoming in relation to a backstop from the United States. I mean, President Macron had a very cordial meeting with President Trump a short time ago, but nothing substantial emerged from it. Can Europe defend Ukraine so there isn't a Minsk I, Minsk II situation without a backstop from the United States?
This is why we continue our dialogue with the United States on the need for the US to stay committed to the security of Ukraine, because once again, it is not sending a message of force to other competitors in the US if you lead to a situation where Russia can just rearm and re-attack Ukraine. It would be not in the interest, of course, of Europeans and Ukrainians, but not in the interest of the US either.
But can Europe do it? I mean, we're talking about a short time ahead, potentially.